Good morning. Good to see you all this morning. I hope you are well fed, well rested, and well prayed. It's really great to be together again. New faces joining us. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Maria for some announcements for you all.
Thank you, Bishop. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So we're going to start with the 11:30 will be midday prayer again in the main chapel, and 12 o'clock will be lunch in the dining room. And from 1 to 6 p.m. we'll have the Sabbath and wellness activities. Please sign up. After this session, we will be taking the sign-up sheets. So please take advantage, sign up for the different activities. We have some meditation, yoga, salsa class, so you can get ready for the first time ever dance with the Mnys stars. So you don't want to miss that. And in order for you to get a little bit ready with that, we have 2 salsa classes. And I believe there's going to be in the monastery lounge, so it will be going up close to the chapel, like passing the chapel. Okay, and what else we have? If you're still in for Bocce, there's Pastor Arden Strasser. Please see him, whoever is still interested in doing the Bocce. As well as Pastor Paul Dunning. Still, if you're interested in doing disc golf, please see Pastor Paul Dunning. And we have, thank you, Pastor Kim. We have a card that we're going to be passing around, Get Well card for Dr. Cooper White. Thank you, Pastor Kim, for the idea, and please sign the card. We will make sure that he gets it. 6 o'clock will be dinner, 7 o'clock Vespers in the main chapel again, and 8 p.m. this time social with our Dancing with the Stars. Get ready. Another announcement from Pastor Linda to all clergy women that would like to be part of this social and supportive group. Please see Pastor Linda Bell. And I think that's all for me. Yep. If you have any questions, any issues with rooms, please let me know, and we'll try to accommodate the best we can. Oh, the meditation classes? Yeah. Yes, then we have our person Euritzi, and we have one that it's like, I guess, beginners, and we have one with another yoga, and that's in the monastery lounge. Mm-hmm.
I mean, what is meditation? No, what is this kind of meditation? Is it guided meditation?
It is a guided meditation, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes? Thank you. Thank you, Bishop.
Maria. Yay, Maria. Great job. Okay, I have the pleasure of welcoming some folks new to our synod since our last retreat. So as you can imagine, it's going to be a little bit of a large group. So what I'm going to ask you to do is when I share your name, please stand up. If you could remain standing, because I think it'd be really cool to see the size of the group when we're done. I'll just ask you to remain standing. We want to welcome these new colleagues, but please hold your applause until the end, because otherwise your talk totally out, because we'll be applauding for people for the whole morning, which is not a bad thing.
Practicing presence.
There you go. Beautiful. All right, so as I announce your names, please stand so that we can welcome you. This person you know from behind the keyboard, Deacon Horace Beasley from Trinity, 100th Street in Manhattan. The Reverend Kelsey Brown from Jehu's Table in Brooklyn. The Reverend Tim Bupp, Redeemer and Trinity in Kingston, over there by the door. Sergio Centeno from Advent in Manhattan. He was our worship leader this morning. Sergio. I'm not sure she has arrived yet. The Reverend Cricket Cooper, who is doing an intentional interim at St. Luke in New Rochelle. I do not see Pastor Cooper. Our worship leader last night, the Reverend Dr. Martha Cruz, who's currently at Fordham in the Bronx. Martha? Okay. Here, in the back of the room. Wonderful. The Reverend Zachary Dean at Calvary in Hauppauge, also our worship leader last night. Vicar Jean Doherty at St. Peter's in Huntington Station. Vicar Jean, over there. Thank you. The Reverend Abby Furjack, Grace in Scarsdale, not yet arrived, I don't believe. Okay. The Reverend John Hickey, Our Redeemer Seaford. John. And the Reverend Andrea Hickey doing chaplaincy in our synod. The Reverend Dawn Morello, First Throgsneck in the Bronx. There's Dawn. The Reverend Jean Montas, also doing chaplaincy and awaiting call. Jean, great to see you. The Reverend Amanda Nesfold, serving Gloria Dei, Huntington Station, and King of Kings in Melville at the back of the room. The Reverend Austin Newberry, doing an interim at St. John on Christopher Street in Manhattan. Here in front of me, Vicar Dale Newton at Hope in Selden. Vicar Dale. Pastoral Associate Dale, who prefers vicar. The Reverend Claire Repsholt, brand new at Our Savior in Patchogue. The Reverend Kirsten Weidman at Grace in Forest Hills doing an interim ministry, and the Reverend Dr. Fred Weidman at Church in the Gardens UCC in Forest Hills. These are our new colleagues. Please give them a warm Metro Synod welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much for being among us and being here at the retreat.
Bishop,
Yes.
we forgot someone. The Reverend Annalise Triolo.
I apologize. Annalise, the Reverend Annalise Triolo, who's at My apologies, Annalise. Welcome. Welcome. Great to have you with us. Okay. Rozella, we are ready for you, and thank you again for your leadership of us this morning. Under the Spirit's guidance, we shall see.
Okay. Oh, my computer went to sleep. It's me. Let's see. Well, good morning. Let's see. How are we? Great. Good. We have a couple of, we're here, right? We're going to begin again with a time of grounding in our bodies. And so this time I do invite you to remain seated. And I always invite folks to put their feet flat on the floor if that's possible. And we sit up, get our back straight, shoulders back, and we just breathe. So I'll just invite you to close your eyes and breathe as you normally would. And I invite you to place a hand on your heart and a hand on your gut, and to repeat after me. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. As you say it this next time, I want you to imagine that these words are pouring out and over and through you. Beloved child of God, leader, teacher, human. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Let us take 3 deep breaths in through our nose and out through our mouths. So breathe in deeply and exhale. Inhale and exhale. One more time. Inhale and exhale. Spirit of the living God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the ability to find times for rest and respite. We give you thanks for the vocations that you have called us to. Gracious God, I give you thanks for each and every person represented here today, for every congregation, for every family, for every experience. We bring to you on this day all that we have and all that we are, trusting in your mercy. It's in Jesus the Christ's name that we pray. Amen. So, we are going to get into key idea number 2 today, where we're going to talk about our personal realities and our histories, our identities, and how they impact our leadership, especially in times of tension. But before we jump into today's conversation, I'm curious if there is anything that came up from yesterday's conversations and experience that were percolating overnight, that you were reflecting on, anything that anyone would like to share today. Yes. I think they're bringing a mic towards you.
Is it on? Yeah. I was reflecting, there you go, on how you spoke about when we listen to our inner critic, that we're really criticizing the one who created us and forgetting the goodness that we are.
Yeah. And our inner critic can be so loud, right? People call it mind tapes or mind trash. Brene Brown calls it the gremlins, right? These voices that come up and that try to remind us of things that are not true. But a lot of times they're pointing to things that are either deep wounds that we have or places and spaces that are tender. And so the invitation is always to pause. It's to pause and notice when what's happening within us is not actually leading to more life, right? I really hate the saying of push through, push through, push through, push through, because I feel like what that invites us to is to not pay attention. It's just to keep going at all cost, at any cost. And I wonder and I use the word violence, I think, intentionally, what violence that does to ourselves. When it's like, I just gotta get through, I just gotta get through, I just gotta get through, I just gotta get through. And are there seasons in our life where we're having to do one thing after another? Sure. And do those seasons actually also require us to abandon ourselves in the midst of it? I think the way of being that we've embraced in our culture is ultimately about the abandonment of self, because if I'm not connected to myself, and I'm not connected to yourself, then we're continuing on in cycles of disconnection. And my community organizing training would lead me to ask the question of who benefits when we're disconnected from self and from each other. So the invitation to pause, and it's not that, I love the question just about meditation. I've been practicing meditation for a while now, And one of the things that I love about the instruction that I've had is this reminder that meditation is not about stopping thoughts, all right? It's not about erasure. It's about the presence and the quieting and the noticing in order to lead to deeper awareness and to also invite us to deeper self-compassion. So even in the practice of like, I'm meditating and then I'm thinking inevitably of all the things that I'm not doing while I'm sitting here meditating, and I'm like, no, I'm coming back to my breath and I'm breathing, and then I'm noticing all the things that I've left undone, and then I'm coming back to my breath and I'm breathing, and then the voice starts to come up. I mean, if you were actually good at what you were doing, you wouldn't be sitting here, and it's like, whoa, where'd you come from? I hear you, and it's not true. And then I go back to breathing, right? So it's not about the stopping, it's about the noticing and the shifting in real time. Any other thoughts or reflections? Yes?
Bring it to me anyway. Good morning, everyone. As a fat person, I've been told a lot of lies about my body and what it is capable of and what it is not capable of. But I have 10 nieces and nephews, and my niece was being bullied at school for being fat. And I went down to Atlanta, where my sister lives, to go visit after she gave birth to twins. And I opened the refrigerator, and there was a Post-it note inside of it that said, "I'm more than the food that I eat." And then I went into my niece's room, and on her mirror, there were all of these Post-its with affirmations. And I cried because I wondered what it would have been like if I would have stopped telling myself the lies that I started to believe from other people. And I think the prayer and connecting with our body reminded me that what a disservice it would be to continue to perpetuate those lies to the people that mean the most to me in the world, and what it might look like if I started to affirm myself in the ways in which my sister was teaching my niece to affirm herself. And I've watched a really significant growth in her from that time to now. And now she's a freshman in college. And she just takes up space in a different way that I wish I would have been bold enough to do as a freshman in college. And I think that that's a really important reminder to all folks, is that we have the ability to do that for the people that are in our care as well, and what it looks like when we fully step into being present in our churches, in our hospitals, in the ways in which we take up space in the world. So I'm really grateful for that from yesterday.
Thank you for sharing that. And I love that invitation, especially, I am someone who's always worked with young girls, teens, women now, like it's been a constant thread through my life. And there are a lot of messages, we know, but this notion that we are literally constantly being told to play small, to be small, play small, think small, be quiet, all right? And that leads to ongoing disconnection of self. But then what are we missing out on, right? As it relates to not only an individual's ability to be present and to share in the world, but also about who we say and think God is in this person, right? And God does not invite us to be small, to play small. And that's why I talk about love big, right? I talk about big as meaning bold, intentional, and generous love. And again, love as a force that creates, liberates, and sustains for our individual and collective healing. Thank y'all. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned yesterday, we'll be going back and forth, engaging in conversations, having reflections, having some small groups. And today we're going to get into our identities. Our identities. So I asked you a question last night, and it was, what parts of your identity and personal history most inform your leadership? And I want you to hold on to that question as we engage in this next section, because you're going to be invited into some conversation around that. So one of my favorite human beings, and I'm just devastated I did not get to meet her in person prior to her passing, is Bell Hooks, Black feminist writer. And she not only has informed what I think about when I talk about a love ethic, but also when we think about identity. So she says that beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world. Beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, not simply its welcome, its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world. One of the things that I love about this statement is that it invites us to reflect on a couple of things. One, for so long, and I'd like to think that we're beyond this, but we know that we're not, we would talk about diversity and community, and we would use the metaphor of a melting pot, right? All of the things kind of melting together. And then we recognize that, well, maybe that's not the best idea, because we're wanting things to go from the many to the one. And then there was times where we talked about it as a salad, right? You have the pieces and the things that hold their own unique space to create this third way, this third thing that come together. But I'm wondering what it would mean for us to push past, there I go, push past, to embrace or lean into a way of thinking about a cultural identity that it's not just about the other, especially in predominantly white spaces and institutions. Bishop and I were talking the other night, and one of the things that we were talking about was just the reality that there is a need for, right, not only cultural competency, I would say anti-racism, anti-privilege, anti-oppression, anti-bias training, all of these things, but for so long, those efforts have been focused on the other. You should engage in this work because you're supposed to be welcoming to the other. You should engage in this work because the other is the one that you're trying to reach. We've never talked about it, or we rarely talk about it, and I'm talking specifically to white folks. We've never talked about this from the standpoint of, actually, I engage in this work because it's about my own liberation as well. It's not about what I'm doing in order to get to another, because at the end of the day, I have agency. You can do all the things you want to do. If I don't want to be a part of your community, I'm not going to be a part of your community. But if you're actually doing the work of embracing your culture, your cultures, understanding your identity, recognizing, in the words of the Aboriginal activists, that our liberation is bound, right? Lila Watson always says that if you've come here to work with me or to help me, then you can go home. But if you've come here because our liberation is bound, then let us work together. And so part of this conversation about reflecting on our personal histories and identities is to again, center ourselves. What is your identity? What is your history? You can extrapolate that to your community that you serve. What are the identities, the histories there? And as a sociology person, at the end of the day, we know that all of these things come together to form a rich tapestry of cultures. And in order for us to engage more deeply with that, again, we have to come back to the affirmation and to the claiming of our personal identity and cultural legacies. I think that sometimes one of the realities that I've had recently is that after I left the ELCA in professional capacity, I was doing some work with some progressive evangelical spaces, which was quite the education in a variety of ways. But one of the things that I started to notice, right, is that in a lot of evangelical spaces, there are much more or many more diverse churches, many more diverse spaces. Now, we could argue about the why, if it's good, if it's bad, we can have that conversation. But one of the things I started to recognize was that the text Galatians 3:28 tended to undergird a ton of the work that's happening in evangelical spaces, right? We are no longer a slave, nor Jew, Greek, nor Gentile, all of that. We are now one in Christ. And I think that in some respects, our text, or the way that we interpret text, can lead us to try to push past the work of individual identity formation and reclamation, because we're trying to get to a reality that is not necessarily ours to force. A reality that's not necessarily ours to force. And I say that because we're always talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, and you use those words in various types of order. And at the end of the day, those things become an output of how we're actually being, of how we're believing, and of how we're behaving. So diversity is not just something that we do for diversity's sake. Diversity actually comes out of a space and place where we've recognized people's identities, cultures, and we've also committed to being communities that actually attend to harm when it happens, that recognize that by inviting people into a space, because that's what you're doing, you're inviting people in. As much as we talk about going out, we end up inviting people in. And if we're inviting people in who are different from us, regardless of what that difference is, and that can be race, ethnicity, ability, gender, orientation, when we're inviting people in, we have to be very clear that what we're inviting them into is not going to cause them harm. And we understand that it won't cause them harm when we've done the good and hard and ongoing work of exploring our identities and the stories that we tell ourselves about who and why and where we are. So there are many things that make up our identity, right? Our gender. Gender is something that we actually have learned is not something that's biological, right? It's something that comes out of norms of culture. So when you hear things like cisgender, if that's a term that you've heard before, that means that there is someone who is showing up in a way that reflects an identity that connects to what you see. So I am a cisgender person, cisgender woman. I show up as a female, as a woman, and that is what you see. And then we talk about sex, right? That's the biological piece of things, which goes beyond gender. So your gender can be one thing, but your sex can be another, right? And then you have your ethnicity. This is your heritage, where your people come from. And then we get into the beautiful construct of race, which we know was created and constructed and yet and still makes meaning. So even if I say race is a construct, which I absolutely believe it is, you better believe that especially in this country, racial categorizations matter. And we've assigned meaning to them. There's resources that are attached to or not attached to. There's generalizations and stereotypes that go along with it, right? Socioeconomic class. It's interesting because a lot of people think that they're middle class, and I have some friends who own homes that they don't live in, and I'm like, I don't think you're middle class. Like if you have a house where you live, and then you have another house where you don't live 24/7, that's not middle class. But it's funny because nobody wants to actually accept the privilege or resources they do have, and when you accept it, you're able to then move with power in ways that then either, what's the word? I just lost the word. Either redistribute or actually use that power and privilege in a way that can help. So it never does us any good even to play small with the power and privilege that we do have, because it's disingenuous. You got a house you're not living in 24/7, you're not middle class. All right, that's some wealth. You got a plot of land that's split between some family members, you're not middle class. That's some wealth. You've got some savings or inheritance that was passed down from you. I didn't learn until I was a young adult that white people use insurance as ways of passing down like resources. That wasn't something that we were taught. But we don't think about the ways that our socioeconomic class actually is not always what we think it is, because we think, well, I grew up in a modest home, or both of my parents worked, or we didn't have a lot of new things or nice things. Those are all trappings. But the reality is if something were to happen to someone in your family who was a breadwinner, would your family be okay for a moment? Or would you be like me and say, I can't be admitted to the hospital because I don't have insurance? So part of it is us becoming clear about where it is and who it is we are. Our ability, our various abilities, whether it's physical, whether it's neurological, all of these things that make us who we are and the beautiful array and diversity of who God has called us to be make up parts of our identity. And then we have things like our profession, what we do. And for many of us, I don't want to say all of us, for many of us, I think we can conflate what we do with who we are. And I think that it can become very dangerous, because when you stop doing the thing, then all of a sudden, you don't know who you are. And as someone who coaches women, specifically women who are going through transition, so I don't necessarily have a specific age group. I coach women that are entering their careers, to women who are retiring, to women who are recently divorced or considering divorce. There's something to be said about how we nurture our identity throughout our life and create boundaries between what it is we do and who it is we are. So I didn't actually get to the things that I do in the world in my introduction yesterday until the end. And I'm saying this because I have seen pastor after pastor, deacon after deacon, clergy person after clergy person, who when they're no longer able to serve in that way, it becomes a life-shattering experience. And not to say that when we end something, there's grief, right? Grief is a healthy part of life and of transition. But when we are no longer able to know who we are, when we stop doing something, I think it invites us to deeper reflection. Relationship status. I often talk about the fact that I am a divorced woman, because that's very different than being a single woman, which is very different than being a widower, right? Our relationship status forms our identity, our sexual orientation, our religion, and our spirituality, our family, citizenship and nationality, ancestry, and languages spoken. Now, in our culture, and in many cultures, people are a part or have multiple identities that make up who they are, right? So I happen to be a woman, I happen to be someone who is heterosexual, I happen to be someone who is a Black Latina, I happen to be someone who is in her 40s, who has a particular level of education. All of these things come together to form who I am. But there are parts of me that come together in the context that we're in that actually lead to oppression in ways that Kimberly Crenshaw named as intersectionality. How many of you have heard the term intersectionality? All right. And one of the things that would frustrate me to no end with this term is that people would just say, well, I have intersectional identities, like all of my identities intersect. And that's not quite what she had in mind when she talked about this concept. Intersectionality is not just about the ideals or the identities that intersect. It's about identities that intersect, that happen to be identities that are marginalized, and then the oppression that someone experiences because of those intersecting identities, right? So we think about those identities that are a part of us and which ones are ones that have been oppressed or are oppressed within the larger culture. And then when those identities come together and we experience oppression at different levels, that is where intersectionality comes to play. So it's a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. So someone who is a Black, trans, fat, queer person with various physical abilities is going to have a very different lived experience, because in this culture in particular, each of those identities have been historically marginalized and or oppressed. Are y'all following? Yeah, y'all are gonna start talking in just a second. So Kimberly Crenshaw, 28 years ago, coined this term, and it's interesting because it's been coming up in politics recently in a way that it was never a part of public discourse. It was generally something studied in academic institutions. But intersectionality, along with identity politics, are two things that we're hearing more and more of, along with critical race theory, which nobody understands what it is. Even the people that continue to say it all the time. And it's very annoying as someone who is educated in a particular way to hear people purposely say things that are misleading and are not actually what the term or concept is about. I want you to think about this conversation that we're having largely around being in times of tension. And I want you to now layer over that questions or issues around identity and how people who live at the intersection of marginalized identity might experience times of tension in ways that others might not. So people that are a part of marginalized communities in our country are already in spaces and places where they're behind the eight ball, if you will, or we're behind the eight ball, if you will, constantly feeling like we're having to catch up. And then something happens globally, locally, and that just compounds what already is going on. And for many of these communities, to pause is a luxury that's unfathomable. Let me say that 5 times fast. To pause is a luxury that is unfathomable. And the push through is literally killing us. The number one killer of black women, do we know what it is? Heart disease, right? And heart disease is directly related to stress. Yes? Uh-oh, which one?
The one that you pause.
Oh, to pause is a luxury that's unfathomable for many communities that have been marginalized in times of tension. Is that the one? Yeah. And we know that pushing through is killing us. So we find ourselves in a conundrum, if you will. What does it mean? And this is where, as leaders, as people of faith who are charged with caring for communities, some of the most diverse communities in our country and in our church, what does it mean for us to create spaces of practice and of reflection and of safety for people to be able to come in with the fullness of their identity and not be harmed? When I worked for the Churchwide, I used to say, I don't want us to be a more diverse church. I want us to be an anti-racist church. I want us to be an anti-privileged church. And then I would get, well, people don't like anti-language. We want to be for something, not against something. Well, I don't know what to tell you. I want us to be anti-racist, anti-privileged, anti-oppressive. You want to know why I'm no longer there? Right? We start to learn that places and spaces may not be able to do or be what you need them to do or be. And once I was able to accept that, I actually stopped being angry. I got really sad and depressed. But we have an invitation. I feel like congregations are centers, can be centers of restoration, healing, and wholeness, but it requires us to look deeply inward and to divest, and I use that term very specifically, to divest from ways of thinking and being that have been set up to divide and destroy. So we talked about identity, and I talked a little bit about the aspects of identity. And there's this iceberg analogy of culture that's been going around forever, right? And it talks about how with an iceberg, we know that you only see a small percentage of the iceberg that's above the surface. And the movie Titanic, along with what happened with the Titanic, was always an example of that, right? The iceberg is massive underneath and smaller up top. So up top, we have those things that are external identity factors, those things that we can see or make sense of externally. And those are the things that are floating along the surface. And then we get below the surface and we have all of those internal things. So I like to use the example of example that we see oftentimes in our communities. We have space for rent, and we're going to rent it to a community, a worshiping community that may not be a part of our denomination, but we're good Lutherans, and we want to share our space. And we're going to rent out this space. And we have some conversations about the space, but we sign up our contract and our agreement, and there we go. And these two communities are markedly different. They're from two different cultures, right? You can choose the cultures, fill in the cultures. It doesn't matter, because a lot of these stories end the same way. We have two different cultures that are now sharing a building, but there has not been clear conversation and negotiation about identity and about story and history. So things start to happen. Stuff starts to be moved off of the walls. Things are shifted off the altar. Not taken, just shifted. Chairs aren't put back just so. Don't let it be a community that cooks food that has more spices than salt and pepper, because then you come into the fellowship hall and it's a smell. And you know what? We're going to have a meeting, or we're going to try to do a joint service, and we'd like our communities to get to know each other, but they don't start on time. And I use there's some like, no, are those knowing chuckles? And you know, down south, don't let us get into parking spots. Well, I'm coming to church and my parking spot is full with other people's cars. And this is just a funny example, but it's one that I think many of us can relate to, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And our intention, we could say, was to share space, but really we need that rent money. And because we need that rent money, we don't necessarily take the time, energy, or even slow down enough to get to know the people that we are being in relationship with. We've moved from a reciprocal and what I would call a revolutionary relationship to a transactional relationship. And in that transactional relationship, we have not stopped to listen and learn about people's identities and the stories that make them. So fast forward, a year later, Bishop is coming in with the Synod staff, because now you got people that won't leave, and then you have people that need to change the locks, and then everybody's mad. And it's like, see, we tried to do that thing that time, and it didn't work. Or those people just don't understand how we do things. So this goes far beyond just thinking about diversity and inclusion and welcome. All right, we're going to watch a video, and then we'll stop talking, and then you're going to talk. So as it's getting queued up, Chimamanda Adichie, how many of you have seen The Danger of a Single Story? Okay. So this is a TED Talk that I come back to often. She is a Nigerian, British writer, Black feminist, incredible thinker, scholar. Sometimes can be, I don't want to say problematic, because I think people are only problematic when we have not taken time to get to know them in some respects. But she offers us this invitation to think about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, who others are. And so I invite you to watch this, and then we'll do some small group conversations.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Haydeé. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Haydeé's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Haydeé's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Ukuloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes. The immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
Good stuff, right? So, I'm going to ask you to experience some conversation, and to do that in some small groups. I would invite you to do a group maybe different than what you were in before, to just explore these questions, and you don't have to answer all of them. Choose the ones that resonate. What single stories have you told yourself about the identities of others? And you could you can also ask yourself, what single story have you told about yourself, right? What parts of your identity have been challenged in your leadership? And are there parts of your identity and personal history that you've tried to hide or change? So I'm going to invite you into conversation, and you'll have about 15 minutes. So try to do, again, groups of 3 or 4, just so that everyone has some time to speak, and then we'll call you back together. All right? Happy connecting.
So it's a double entendre. It's really a cool song. If you ever want to, if you have an Alexa, it's pretty awesome. It's a great song. It's kind of fun. So is Lena really coming back? We can start. Yeah. What song is it? Is it awkward standing? Lena, we decided rather than trying to figure out the seating, we'd all stand. You can stand nice and yeah, you can stand around. Part of the reason is we got the doesn't have any sort of negatives. Well, in our culture, right? But for somebody perhaps maybe it's a different story, you know. But that's something we don't. I would say we don't. But you have choosing a good player, whatever guess you like. But you could just walk in that house. And not have to explain, not have to describe. Yeah. Yeah. But it's a choice you can make. There you go. That's a Native American biracial. That's what it is. I have constantly playing as part of my challenge. Yes, I really am Native American. Dominant ones, but was my dad really excited? Yeah. It's a regular reception. And but then a lot of they see something, oh, you look at so here's this town about
5 more minutes.
Having a single story about that, or whatever, I asked up to that
I'm going to invite you to begin to wrap up your last thought. So, we're coming back together. And the goal is that these are all conversation primers. That the conversation doesn't end. We just pause it. But I'd like us to maybe hear what came up for you in your conversations. So as you listened, as you heard and watched the video, as you engaged in some conversation, let's hear what came up. And I think we have 2 microphone runners so that we can hear folks. Yes, we'll start over here.
Hello? Okay, good.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with the ridiculous, and then we can go to the sublime.
I love it.
The ridiculous is I don't drink coffee.
Well, I don't think that's ridiculous.
Right?
Is that ridiculous?
In a Lutheran church?
Listen.
It's the third sacrament in my church. So, and the other part of it is that I don't drink herbal tea. I need caffeine as much as you people do.
Oh, so you're saying that you need something?
No, I'm saying that I've been challenged about that.
Oh! I gotcha. I was waiting for yes, that makes sense. I love it. Yes, back here.
One of the things that sparked in my mind is not only that I need to claim my identities, but the times when my identity is not acknowledged by others. Mm-hmm. So as a queer person and as a person who, I hate the word survivor, but a survivor of sexual harassment, mm-hmm. both of those are part of my identity, mm-hmm. but I have also been in context where those were, you're playing the victim. You're playing the victim. Gay lifestyle, not identity. Mm-hmm. And those are very hurtful experiences because they're erasure of something I have worked to claim.
Yes. No, thank you for sharing that, right? And I love how she ends when she talks about, it's about the restoration or the recognition of the dignity, right? The full dignity of a person. And how all of those experiences, whether we see them or we don't see them, because there's some parts of our identity that we can't tell by looking at a person. And this is where the art of listening and sacred storytelling and connecting relationally invites us into a deeper knowing. Yes, over here. North Carolina, even though you don't have on your blue today.
And I'm a Duke fan, not a Carolina fan. But anyway.
I'm telling y'all. Whew. Devils.
My husband is Chilean. Mm-hmm. And we've been together 10 and a half years. And the learning of different stories from the simplest thing of saying, and not because of the country, but I said, oh, you're Latino and you're Chilean, you must like hot food. And then he did the way, he says, we're not all Mexicans, I'm from Chile, and so it was all that kind of stuff. But just not only visiting, but also having family, his family come and learning. You know, one of the things that he said to me is he can't stand the phrase Latine or Latinx or Latino or Latina. He says, I'm from Chile. He said, it wasn't until we came to the United States that we got this label put on us. He said, we're Argentinians and Chileans and Mexicans and everything. But my whole mind, even teaching me to watch Eurovision and learn, you know, when she was talking about different things, all kinds of stuff in the last 10 and a half years. I was telling Sonia, I kind of came to it late, you know, I'm getting older, but wow, you know, learning the different stories because of having a husband from a totally different culture and a totally different family setup, you know. I mean, I was devastated. The first Thanksgiving we had, we went to the Macy's parade and then we went out to eat. And then the next year I said, okay, we're going to do so-and-so. He says, no. And I said, why? Because my family, Thanksgiving was big. He said, first of all, Thanksgiving is an American concept.
Yes.
We don't celebrate it in Chile. And he said, second of all, with my family, when we had Christmas, Mom would make the dinner and everybody would go to their own bedrooms and watch TV. We didn't have this big family gathering. So a lot of learning over the years.
And with that learning comes the renegotiation, comes the deconstruction, comes the conversations around what are our non-negotiables, what is it that, how am I being called to love you in ways that respect the whole of who you are? And it takes patience. It takes so much patience and time, right? It does not happen overnight. And to that point, right, we use in our denomination, right, Black, Indigenous, people of color, or various types of ways to categorize folks. And I struggle with it even as I use it because that's the language that generally white people need to understand who we are. But the reality is that we group people together, which is what happened to white folks. It was an erasure of your cultural identity, and you have to ask the question of why. Why were our separate identities erased in order to conflate to form whiteness, right? And what is lost in that? So, yeah, lots of conversations over what we call ourselves, because we often don't get to choose what we call ourselves. Other people tell us what to call ourselves. Yeah, here and then here. Got it.
You're so quick. Thank you so much. I didn't share this in our group, but I did my internship, my seminary internship in Southern California, and I changed part of my identity. Prior to the time that I left for college, I was very proud to be from Long Island. It would be maybe the first thing I told people about myself when they would ask me about myself. And I changed my accent when I was living in California because I was tired of people asking me to say water and coffee and dog and whatever else they could pick out as something that was New York. We are pastors and we say water 1,000 times in a baptism. I would change that part of my accent so that that wasn't the first thing that people asked me about when a sermon was done. Or, oh, I heard your accent come out today. A lot of the identities that are mine, you can tell by looking at me. So the pieces that are important to me, like when I talk to my mom, and now she's in Florida, and I get off the phone and my fiance's like, why is that how you're talking right now? I would adapt and change. And we, for Black folks, we talk very frequently about code switching. The way that I talk to my friends from childhood is not the way that I'm talking to, it is the way I'm talking to the people at Jehu's table because we share various intersections with one another. But we do that all the time. And that little change or that hiding is a protective measure just as much as it is a piece of that identity.
Absolutely. And code switching, for anyone who doesn't know, is when we literally are translating in real time, not just spoken language, but behavior, vernacular, references, right? And so folks, and I love how Resma Manikim talks about it because he doesn't talk about Black and white as much as he talks about bodies of culture and white bodies in his work around embodiment and deconstructing the racism inherent within us all. But this notion that we're constantly in spaces and places, bodies of culture, where you're having to translate, right? For some of us, it's actually the language, right? So I don't know if you've ever been somewhere where English is not the primary language spoken, And either you may speak the language of the place you are in or you're learning it, but do you ever notice how exhausted you are, right, at the end of the day? And I always know when I go back home to Puerto Rico, I'm like, okay, here we go, I can do it, because my family is not gonna speak to me in English, so I gotta be ready. And then I come home and I'm like, oh my God, I'm exhausted, right? Because you're constantly thinking. So just think about that for your colleagues whose first language may not be English. They're constantly translating in real time. There's no amount of money that actually, I think, covers the work that they do. I think we always need to pay more for translation because it's, and then you talk about theological language and all these things, right? It goes to a whole nother level. But then you also have those cultural switching, right? So even the way my body, how I am in public or in primarily white spaces is very different from how I might be at home. And all of us have that to a degree, and there's a whole other way of being. Funny story. There's a couple funny stories. I remember talking one day with my mentor, who happens to be a white woman, and I grew up knowing her. And we were talking, and we got into the conversation, and I don't remember what we were talking about, but we were heated, going back and forth. It was a good conversation. And then I was like, who are you telling? And she stopped, and she was like, I'm talking to you. And I was like, oh, shit, yeah, okay. I was agreeing with you. That was my way of agreeing with you, right? Or the funny story of a black guy that was, it's not so funny, but was in a diner, and a white person overheard him saying, I'm about to go blow this bathroom up. He was going to defecate. Right? So it goes from the ridiculous to the sublime, but the reality is that these are constantly at play. Yes.
Yeah. We were blessed to have a really good range of age and experience in the group. But one of the things that came out is how you deal with not just your own claimed identity, but the identity put on you. So I had a recommendation against my ordination because of my style. Undefined. I knew what it meant. My style was incompatible with most of Lutheran churches. Fortunately, there was a Synod staff person at the time who said, maybe so, but there are churches waiting for this style. But the way we react to what's put on us, in that case it was hippie priest, you're too happy, you make jokes, whatever it is, and you kind of go, yeah, absolutely. If you don't like that, I'll go someplace else.
Yeah.
Or educate about it, but say I'll take that as, unless you're being physically violent about it, we can deal with it. That's what you see, and I'll claim it, or I'll correct you. And the same was true for the others in the group, or we're learning along the way for that.
Oh. Yes, I saw a hand back here. I wanted to say what you were referring to, too, about who sets the standards, right? I'm always asked when I became Lutheran, and am I really Lutheran? What does that mean? And so I get it from both sides, from being a Texan and people not having any idea what Lutheranism was about. And then when I got older, I was like, we're actually the reason all these other denominations exist. But, having to just remind folks. And then from the other side, constantly being at events and being asked all the time, oh, are you Lutheran? Yeah, well, what makes you think I'm not? Right? Back here.
Yeah, some people know me and my English that's not fine. I'm Pastor Fabian from St. Peter, and I try to explain my experience. You don't understand, we had the amazing translation here, Roberto and other people.
We understand you just fine. Good. Your English is great.
That beautiful and personal experience was, and when I started my pastoral life here in New York in 22, my first call was Zion Lutheran Church in Harlem, and this one was 100% Latino congregation, and we had a different problem with the building. We moved into the St. Peter in 2012, And my personal identity and my background, especially for my religion, is I'm from Roman Catholic, and the Our Lady, that Virgin Mary, was very important in my life. And we stand in our Zion Lutheran Church, the Our Lady of Guadalupe, and was the very important part in our liturgical life. The Christ was center, but she is mother of the Christ. When moving to the St. Peter was okay, no problem, but when we started processing for the merger, was a hard problem, especially for the theology. Was 2 years hard conversation, for 2 years. Finally, I don't know they accept, but they is okay. Because it's hard. And every liturgical, and Haydeé Newman know very good because she came in one time for a beautiful exposition about the Guadalupe for us. And we had the mass 1:30, so we put the Guadalupe picture, beautiful picture that Roberto and Christopher buy in Mexico. And the mass we take for the sanctuary because come another service. Every Sundays we put it the 1 o'clock, 1:30, and after the mass we take the picture because we know what the conflict. And well, we started the merger, and 2012 was the merger with congregation, and now the Guadalupe every Sunday for 10:30 service Anglo community, 1 p.m. to the Latinos, and 5 for the church service. The Guadalupe is part of our liturgy, and everybody that was happy. But this was a beautiful thing now that our mother is part of our liturgical and our community.
Oh, thank you. I feel like that perfectly sums up so many things. Thank you for sharing that. One, I'm gonna need y'all to stop apologizing for your English when you are perfectly fluent, right? Yes. And two, that example goes back to what we talked about with iceberg culture analogies, right? Things that matter, things that are external, things that are internal, the judgments we make about people and cultures and traditions. And I feel like we have idolized our theological tradition in a way that is very exclusive and can be very harmful. As much as we talk about the biggest gift that Lutherans have is our theology, right? At the end of the day, our theological reverence as it relates to Lutheranism actually causes a ton of harm. And I think when we don't have theological imaginations and a way of thinking not only about God, but about our denomination, about our spirituality and those practices that are expansive, that create more space, we will continue to see the dwindling and the disconnection that is so prevalent across the denomination. At the end of the day, church as we know it is gone. It's gone. Right? And I say that not because I don't believe that communities of faith are necessary parts of the fabric of our society and our lives, but the way that we understand church, the way that we have experienced it over the last 50 to 60 years is done. And unless we are willing to reckon with our personal identities and those stories that we've told about ourselves, the stories that we have for others, and also the story that we have made up about God, who God is, how God loves, what is necessary to be in relationship with God. Because we might say there's nothing we can do in terms of our relationship with God, but at the end of the day, between our commitment to theological correctness and the way that we worship ritual and tradition, I think we sometimes are getting in our own way. We're going to talk about theology more tomorrow, though. But thank you for your time and attention.
Rozella, thank you so much. And thank you all for participating in these wonderful conversations. Very challenging, but also very life-giving. Worship is at 11:30, lunch at 12. I see one of our new pastors has arrived, Pastor Abby Furjack at Grace in Scarsdale. Abby. And I also neglected, as I was talking about new people, to introduce Haydeé Moe, who is vicar at Advent in Manhattan. Haydeé. And John, you're pointing at somebody. Help me.
Oh, it's Cricket from New Rochelle.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know who you are. Pastor Cricket Cooper, who was the intentional interim at St. Luke in New Rochelle. Welcome. So good that you all could join us. Great to see you again. Anybody I missed, please, let's not overlook anyone. Okay, so worship 11:30, lunch at 12, and then a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy yourselves. God bless you. Yes, Amanda?
Just very quickly, any proclaimers that want to lunch together, let's find each other in the chapel after worship, because we'll all be there at the moment anyway. So
Got it. Any
proclaim
proclaimers?
lunch.
Talk to Amanda.
Find me.
Great. Blessings, everyone.